Now I've seen the structure of the exam, I'm coming up with some tips now to save us that 1 mark that we might lose, because I've seen these over and over and over again, and I've heard from different markers say these are the problems that students have, and this is where an extra mark can be gained. So I'll go through several tips, and I'll probably show an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. My first tip is I suggest you show working for all of your questions. We can give part marks for some of the working out, even if your answer is incorrect. So as long as you've got some correct steps, we can get that towards the answer. If we look at this question, we talk about net pay. We understand net pay is your gross pay, take away all of your deductions. And if we have a look at the deductions for tax, it said $269.17. Now, I marked papers where some students wrote the number $296, so they've misplaced those numbers back to front. We were still able to give them full marks for that question because they had shown me working out and they knew how to work out net pay, that it was the gross pay take away the deductions, so they still got that mark even though their answer was technically wrong. My next tip is to read graphs carefully and use a ruler to draw your graphs and diagrams accurately. Take a ruler into the exam. We hear that from markers quite often. Copy your diagrams into your answer booklet neatly, putting any information that you gather onto the diagram itself, and check that your answer is reasonable and it answers the question that was asked. I would suggest if you have a graph drawn there that you use your ruler and go straight across the axes to where you want to find your answer and straight down, because there is not much margin for error, so you have to read graphs very accurately. Another tip: check you can do your basic calculations. We need to be able to use your calculator. Be careful when there's a square root symbol, fractions, trig functions, brackets, and squaring of negative numbers specifically. So if we have a look at some questions for you to have a go at. If we look at this first question, I would suggest that you put brackets underneath the square root symbol so that you get an answer of 5. The second question, we've got a numerator and a denominator. I always put brackets around the top line and the bottom line before I do the calculation, and I get the answer of 2. The third question, if you check your calculator is in the right degrees mode, tan 45 is 1. And this is a good check that the HSC examiners use just to make sure your calculator is in the right mode. We actually do check all the 3 different modes for all the calculations later on, so that doesn't affect your marks. In the fourth one, I always put brackets around negative numbers when I square them to get an answer of 10. In the fifth one, I use this as a division. You can see this coming from the sine rule, so you get an answer in the high 30s. And the last question, when you do the calculation here, you'll get an answer of 5. Don't forget you've got to use the square root button to find the answer on that one. The next tip: be familiar with the appropriate terminology of the course and the glossary of key terms. Questions where it says show, explain, justify means to find with appropriate calculations. So I don't use the word show, I cross that out and I use the word find. If we have a look at the example, the location of Sarong and the location of Darwin. We know the difference in latitude is going to be 11 degrees. The next question says show that the great circle. We cross out show and we write find the great circle distance between Sarong and Darwin. When we do that calculation, we notice that it comes up just over 1,200 kilometres, so therefore it's answering the question using mathematical calculations. The compare and contrast question means what is the same and what is different about this particular data. We can see here the tallest tree in this particular park is 18 and it's in East Park. The median height of the trees in Central Park is going to be 7, but let's have a look at the compare and contrast question. The data set by examining shape and skewness, measures of location and spread. So if we think about that, we're talking about skewness is going to be positive skewed, negative skewed, or normal distributed. The measures of location are going to be mean, mode, and median, the 3 M's. And the measures of spread are the 3 interquartile range, standard deviation, and range. So they're asking us to compare and contrast between the 2 data sets here. So for instance, you would want to write something like Central Park's median is higher than East Park's median. The range for East Park is larger than the range for Central Park. Central Park is normally distributed, whereas East Park has a positive skewness. So that's giving us what one is compared to what the other one is. And another term that students are not aware of is the word evaluate. It does mean to find a numerical value, so I'm looking for a number at the end of that. Okay, another tip that I have is for worded answers need to be written in the context of the question. This is specifically for students who drop down into the general maths. We're talking about real life situations here. We need to give answers with mathematical meaning, i.e. show calculations for this mathematical meaning. And the number of marks allocated to a question indicates the depth of the solution which will be required. For instance, you'll give a reason or explain type questions. If we have a look at the question that's here about a World Cup rugby match, we have a stadium. We can see that there's 60,000 people in the stadium, and then they leave and it takes about 30 minutes. Now, if we write down the value of A happens to be 60,000, and give an explanation of its meaning here. The explanation is not the y-intercept. The explanation is the amount of people at the stadium, at the match. So you want that 60,000 to be in context of the question. And the value of B in this case, even though it's sloping backwards, it had a negative in the actual equation. So therefore the value of B is the 2,000. And what does that value represent? It doesn't just represent a gradient, it represents the rate of change of people from the stadium. So when you're talking gradient, you want to know about rate of change. I would suggest for the equations that you write down each step when you're solving or rearranging an equation. If there's a question that requires a substitution into a formula, write down your formula, write down the values that you're using into that formula so we can see that substitution of what you're doing before you do your calculations. If we look at this solve question, it says 3 marks, and so therefore we want to basically see 3 correct steps along the way in this. So marks are awarded for each step that you are getting correct, up to the 3 marks fully for the correct solution there. So my indication for all algebra is make sure every single step is written down. Even if if you think you know the answer, you just write down every set of working out to attribute those marks. I always write down the calculator display before you round your answer off, and only round in the last step of working out. There's always a question in the paper that has a mark specifically checking for the correct rounding, and there's always a mark for correct units. And make sure you've answered the question that's being asked of you. So important step about that calculator display, make sure it's written down every step of the way until the last step, then you finally write your calculator display before you round. Having a look at a question. This question involves several of these tips. Here's a garden bed. The first question says show that the area of the garden bed is 57 square metres. Well, instead of show, I suggest we're using the word find. Find the area of the garden bed. If we do that correctly, the answer comes out to be 57 square metres. In part 2, we're adding 5 centimetre layer of straw. Here's where the correct units is being checked. They're seeing if you can convert 5 centimetres to 0.05 metres and then finding out your volume for your the amount of straw. The third part talks about if each bag holds 0.25 cubic metres of straw, how many bags? When you calculate this, the answer comes out to be 11.4 bags. But thinking about that, you can't have 11.4 bags of straw to put across the top. You're actually going to have to round this up to 12 bags. So there's a check to see if your understanding of correct rounding can be done. And the last part talks about the straight fence. Using Pythagoras' theorem, you find it's the square root of 62, and that answer is going to be 7.8. But students who don't write down 7.8 first of all before rounding to 8 sometimes get that wrong. So make sure whatever your calculator says, you write that down first before you do your rounding.